Welcome to our Ask the Expert series. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome and thank you for joining us. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. For today's live Q&A topic, we'll be discussing safety and performance measures and acceptance criteria. We have two presenters today. Joining us is Laurie Mitchell, founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Laurie has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety, and pharmacovigilance management and regulatory reporting. Having provided regulatory and medical writing solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, she is a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Laurie is a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. Also joining us is Dr. Sarah Chavez, Principal Medical Writer with Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in Biochemistry and a PhD in Molecular and Cellular Biology with 25 years of laboratory bench experience. She has also taught at the university level for the past 15 years. Sarah has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment, as well as for several large textbook publishers. Sarah's strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as part of the Criterion Edge team. And now I'd like to welcome Laurie to give an overview of our session today.
So thank you everyone for joining today. I think this is going to be a great live session with all of your questions. As Olivia said earlier in the webinar, we've got a lot of attendees. We had over 200 people sign up for this webinar. So clearly this is a topic of great interest to our colleagues out there, and we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible. So we're hoping that in this session today, you're going to know more about identifying meaningful safety and performance endpoints, or the measures or objectives, they go by a few names, how to demonstrate that safety and performance objectives are appropriate and clinically relevant, and then how to identify and choose the acceptance criteria for those objectives that are related to your device. So we can get started right now.
All right, our first question today comes from Andrea. Can you see the question on your screen, Laurie and Sarah?
Yes.
Yes, great. Our first question is, what are the best means of comparing safety and performance parameters? Can you give us any guidance?
So Sarah, I'll let you take that one.
I think this goes back to sort of proper scoping and truly identifying what claims you're making about your particular device. So as you're trying to compare safety and performance parameters, you want to find both your closest competitors, you want to define your competitive landscape, but then you also need to identify how those competitors are measured within the clinical literature and within the guidelines. So it goes back to identifying relevant clinical practice guidelines and recommendations early in the process, identifying and clarifying who your competitors are very early on. And then as you're sifting through the competitor data, seeing if there are specific safety and performance objectives that are commonly reported, and making sure that those are in alignment with any clinical practice guidelines that have been published.
I'll just jump in and say there that Sarah made a very good point, and we field this question a lot too. So this is sort of a related question. Is it how clients ask us, how do we identify the safety and performance objectives in the first place? Like, how do we define them? And we're not really sure what they should be. And we have helped clients answer that question often through doing systematic literature reviews, which is what's out there in the competitive world and how are they, kind of doing a pilot search, if you will. Look at your competitor landscape. What are they publishing about? What are their safety and performance? What are their endpoints? Not even safety and performance. What endpoints are they identifying in the studies that they've published? That's a good place to start to look for safety and performance objectives. To look for ways to define your safety and performance objectives.
All right, thanks, Laurie. Our next question comes from Chris Lane. How are the acceptance criteria defined when there is no standard or specific regulation?
I'll let Sarah take that.
Yes, so this is where your competitive landscape and the data that you've identified through your systematic literature review really come into play. We have had instances where there isn't a clinical practice guideline that's been published with regard to your specific device. And in that case, you identify your closest competitors, you extract the data to locate the ranges of performance and safety, and then the acceptance criteria are going to be based largely on your competitive landscape. You can also identify some relevant state-of-the-art alternatives and define those, but you're really going to be relying heavily on the range that you've identified through your competitor search.
Thanks, Sarah. Here's our next question. What is the exact relationship between safety and performance, benefits, claims, and acceptance criteria?
So before I let Sarah jump in there, this is a great question because it really allows us to talk a little bit more with our audience today about how all of these things interact. And all of these elements interact in your CER, or for our IVD colleagues on the call, for your PER. Safety and performance, benefits, claims, risks. I would also add risks to that list, and acceptance criteria. So these are all knitted together. So Sarah, what are your comments on this?
Well, really, it sort of comes down to, again, that sort of identifying those safety and performance objectives early on. When you think about a claim, or that's typically used to present sort of like from a marketing perspective. So like a claim would be that your device can perform well in a tight space or something like that. If you have a smaller version of a device that is more versatile, if you are limited during surgery by space constraints. So that's a claim. The actual benefit would be maybe something in terms of allowing the patient to still undergo a laparoscopic surgery versus open surgery. Mm-hmm. You know, those are going to be benefits. The safety and performance objectives could be things like bleeding risk, or the total hospitalization time, the total time of the procedure, things like that. And then the acceptance criteria would be the range. So if you identify that the performance or the time for the procedure is anywhere from 1 minute to 3 minutes, and other devices that require open surgery need it to be closer to 10 minutes, that's part of your acceptance criteria. The acceptance criteria are the range at which your competitors perform. All of your competitors can perform between 1 and 3 minutes. So you want to be able to establish that you can perform in a way that's in line with your closest competitors. You're at least as good as your closest competitors. So they all definitely are related and interconnected, and you want to make sure that they're aligned well, that your safety and performance objectives that you select inform and are derived based on some of the benefits and the risks that you've identified. But make sure that not everything that's a marketing claim can be strictly backed up by the clinical literature. Some things are marketing claims and some things are actual clinical benefits and risks.
So I'll jump in and say that for benefits and risks, and the claims, so the claims, mm-hmm. Claims that are identified in the literature of the client, of the device, are then really looked at with great scrutiny in the risks and benefits section of the CER, where you're pulling out the claim language one by one, and like operates well in a tight space. So if there are data that have been on the subject device, or there is the safety and performance objectives that talk a safety or a performance objective that might talk about defining a tight space and then pulling the acceptance criteria for that, all of those claims statements must be backed up, as Sarah just said, by some sort of data that establish the claim so that it is true. We are the fastest XYZ on the market is, of course, a horrible claim to write down. But if you're going to stand by that, then you actually have to use data to establish that, yes, indeed, we are the fastest XYZ device over our competitors. So, and there has to be data to establish that claim language.
All right. Here's our next question. This person is interested in learning how specific versus how general outcomes should be in terms of identifying key outcomes.
That really depends on your device, but I will say that we have a general outcome could just be something as simple as device success, technical success, like did the device perform as intended? If there are specific parameters under that heading, as a rule, I generally try to extract those as well, because I do think it helps if you have a very wide range that you've identified in terms of technical success. If there are specific reasons why you might not have been successful, it's helpful to sort of tease those apart as part of your safety and performance objectives. But those general outcomes are still relevant and helpful because in many cases, if this is sort of an ancillary reporting in the literature, if it's not sort of the focus of that article, you may just have them report technical success in general. They're not going to necessarily explain why they failed. They're just going to say this % was successfully implanted or something to that effect.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Our next question comes from Annika. What is a good legacy device strategy when there is no clinical objective evidence for an accessory product?
So Sarah, before you jump in, I'm going to say we have many, many questions. We're going to try to answer this question broadly because this is a great example of many of the questions that we received today and even in other webinars. How do you wrap your head around safety and performance objectives for legacy devices, simple devices, accessory devices, class 1 devices, you name it. How do we choose correct safety and performance objectives? How do we identify acceptance criteria for those devices when there are no professional guidelines or standards and nobody writes about them, i.e. out in the clinical literature? So Sarah, that's, let's cue that up as that kind of that broad question, and let's hear what your comments are and how we address this often with our clients at Criterion Edge.
Yes, so this is definitely in line with one of the other questions in our Q&A box about what do you do for something like a guide wire or a surgical instrument, where how do you define it if there really isn't specific data reported for that particular product? And in that case, you can select other relevant performance. It may be something like the performance or surgical success, procedural success. If it's used as part of an overall system or it's ancillary to that system, you can discuss how it performs as part of the overall system or the overall protocol.
Right, and that's a surrogate endpoint because it's implied that if your guide wire was used in XYZ type of procedure, and the procedure was successful, then the performance of the guide wire then is assumed or presumed to have been successful as well, unless the particular article that you're looking at says the guide wire kinked, we had to take it out and use another one. Unless it says things like that, that procedural success becomes a surrogate for the the performance success of the device. So I wanted to make that really very clear. Now, one more thing, Sarah, I know I'm jumping in a little bit, but this is where systematic literature review, robust systematic literature review processes come into play, because when we do our systematic literature reviews at Criterion Edge, we use a librarian, we have ProQuest Dialogue as our platform, and what we get back from the systematic literature review on all of the articles is the abstract, the indexed terms, the terms that are the devices listed in the full text article itself, because you may be asking, well, how will I know if my particular guide wire was used in this particular procedure? You have to dig. You have to look at you have to pull the article. You have to look at it and see that, you know, devices used, Medtronic XYZ, Abbott XYZ, device blah, blah, blah. And then you'll know that your device lands in that, in the procedural success of that article. So keep going, Sarah. I'm sorry, I jumped in.
Oh, no. I was just going to say that if you have a situation where it's difficult to make a direct claim, or if there isn't a specific medical purpose, you know, if you have one of these devices where you know you're not going to have a lot of clinical data specific to your device, there are some regulations regarding the common specifications and how you would address those particular devices with respect to your risk management and your safety. So you will be expected to clarify what you mean by acceptable risk and acceptable levels of safety, and justify what are the acceptable risks. So you will be expected to refer to industry guidelines and standards for the device or for similar devices, in comparison to the ranges that you've identified as part of your state-of-the-art search. So it's still expected that you've done your due diligence, that you've looked for any relevant clinical practice guidelines or standards that exist within the industry. But you may have more challenges identifying specific data within the reported in clinical literature. So but that's where the standards can definitely help.
Thanks, Sarah. Our next question is a two-parter from Bruno, and he's asking what kind of acceptance criteria can be defined, and what should we do in case of lack of state-of-the-art evidence to support these criteria?
Yeah, in this case, the acceptance criteria are going to be derived from the data that you've extracted. So it's sort of an the way it's phrased, it's a little bit confusing, because if you don't have enough evidence to support the criteria were actually built on the data that you've identified.
The competitor device data.
Right, from your competitor device data. Right. So really, in effect, I think what it's asking is, what would you do if there's just not a whole lot of data that exists? And how would you then sort of further bolster the criteria that you've identified? If you only identify 2 or 3 articles published in the past 5 or 10 years that report on a similar competitor device, then in that case, that is what it is. You would still present that you've only, like, you searched, you used correct mesh terminology, you did a proper literature search and screening. There were very few articles identified. So you would still report the acceptance criteria that have been identified as part of your current systematic literature review, but you would also then benefit from consulting maybe meta-analyses of older articles that wouldn't have been captured. This is particularly helpful if you have a technology that's been on the market for years and years. Maybe it hasn't been published in the past 5 years, but when it first came out 10 years ago, there was a bunch of publications. If you can find a few meta-analyses that really go through sort of the history of that particular device or similar devices, and you can present that data, that can also help you define that acceptance criteria by showing what the competitive landscape looked like from more of a historic perspective.
So I love this question and this answer, because I want to just drive home the point, the overall, the larger point that we're making here is, and it was summarized when Sarah said, it is what it is. Mm-hmm. And that means that, but she had a lot of caveats around that, which is, did you do a proper, robust, methodologically sound, required search? Or did you just go to the internet? So this searching is, that methodology is highly scrutinized by the notified bodies, because it has to be reproducible, transparent, robust, meet best practices, and to have the time range to be robust enough to capture all of this. But if you've done all of those things and you show your methodology for screening, the selection of included articles, and then the extraction of data, if you've laid all that out, all that methodology out in a CER or a PER, and at the end of the day there were 3, then it is what it is. Because this notified body doesn't want you to conjure up data. They don't expect that. They expect that you have cast the net wide enough and robustly enough, and you have great and MDR compliant best practices, and then the results are what they are. And so this is a very, very good example of that. But you have to be robust.
All right, thanks, Laurie. Our next question comes from Lindsay. For devices where safety and performance are a function of size, should you set safety performance acceptance criteria for each available size, or should you use a conservative approach and set the rate using the worst case scenario?
Yes, we have encountered this quite a bit, particularly for families of devices where you may have like a large bore, a mid-size bore, and a small bore access size. In that case, what we've done in the past is we set the overall acceptance criteria. So we say that if we pooled all of these data together, we can get a range of technical success is anywhere from 90% to 99%. If we separate it out, maybe the smaller ones have a lower range than the larger ones. In that case, we would also present the performance criteria broken down by size or groupings, because that would give the notified body a sense that you have your overall range, but you also are acknowledging that one size may confer more challenges in that particular technique than another size.
So Sarah, I've got a follow-up question to that. So if this is a, if you're identifying acceptance criteria from the competitor device and you've established one, like the broad range for all sizes, the range is 90 to 99%. But for 16 French and up to 18 French, it's these acceptance criteria and so on and so forth. You've stratified it into these groups. Okay, that's the acceptance criteria. And that is that's now about to be compared to the subject device and the subject device family. So you're saying that then if your subject device, a device or family, product family that's under evaluation has those similar breakdowns of sizes that you just now extracted data out of the competitors for those that have those specific sizes, then then when you go out, you're going to be using which criteria, size to size, or, the overall broad range?
Yes, I think that's the advantage. Yeah, that's the advantage of breaking it down by size, I think, is that if your family includes small and large sizes and you're extracting data for the large sizes, you wouldn't want to necessarily, it may make it appear that your small size device doesn't meet up, when really they overall have different acceptance criteria, different ranges for performance.
Right.
So it's something that you would definitely want to tie together and link together from your clinical literature section and your state-of-the-art section. You would want to make an explanation as to why you're breaking it down the way you are, that there are differences, and sort of write that both in tabular and in like a narrative format. So that it's clear that you didn't just arbitrarily choose size cutoffs, that there is an inherently higher risk associated with a procedure that uses a large bore, because it's going, a larger sheath is more opportunity to puncture the tissue or to have uncontrolled bleeding or something like that. So in that case, you would want to make sure that you explain why you've chosen the cutoffs that you've identified.
And then one last point to make to the audience is that you're going to need data. If you stratify this into large, medium, small bore, whatever the case may be, you're going to need at the end of the day data to on all of those sizes to compare back to the acceptance criteria. If you stratified it and you have no data for this on your, and this is on your subject device now, and you have no data or a paucity of data on your small bore, for example, you may, but plenty on your medium and large bore of your own devices. The notified body may look at that CER and say, looks good for large and medium bore devices, but you only have, you have inadequate data sufficiency for your small bore. So that you have to keep that in mind too, is there needs to be enough robust data across all those stratifications in order to pass notified body scrutiny. Do you agree with that, Sarah?
Oh, definitely.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's our next question. This one comes from Anne. She's asking if you can use equivalent device or literature for class 1 and 2A CERs under MDR.
So we're talking about, can you use equivalence, the equivalence route, essentially, for low class devices, which is class 1 and class 2A. That's what the question is. So Sarah, do you have any comments on that?
I think in short, yes, you should be able to, as long as you can establish that equivalence. As long, you know, I don't think there's any distinction between it being a class 1 or a class 2A as far as the level of, you're still expected to be able to establish that it's equivalent.
Right. Yeah, and equivalence is a whole other webinar and a whole other discussion, because we find that we find in the CERs that we either revise or update or do gap analyses on, that equivalence is sometimes well done, but more often than not is you know, incomplete and doesn't really establish the firm equivalence for clinical, technical, and biological aspects of the device. So equivalence is a big section of a CER and really must be very, very robust and very granular. So thanks for the question.
Okay. Our next question comes from Joette. In the new medical devices, do we need to provide clinical development plan or CDP? Can you let us know what exactly we need to provide there?
So I can jump in on that one if you like, Sarah.
Sure.
We've written CDPs for our clients, and I'll be honest about what the requirements are in MDR for that particular internal documentation. I can say that we refer to the CDP in an MDR CER, that it is part of it's an input into the CER to some degree, but we have definitely written CDPs for clients, and that's just been in the last year or year and a half, really. So that is becoming a plan that is now becoming firmly established in the medical device community, that there must be a clinical development plan. But when we haven't written those for our clients, we notice that they tend to be written from the clinical affairs department or the clinical science department, and it starts from the beginning in the non-clinical arena and the early development, all the way through tracking that device through its development and testing and revisions and so forth. So there's a lot to be developed within the CDP, and much of it is very early planning and staging, and then the clinical investigations that it's gone through, the revisions it's gone through, the IFU updates that it's gone through. That's the best I think that we can answer about what needs to be provided, the information that needs to be provided in a CDP. But if you haven't developed one yet, I think you better look internally to begin to put that on your radar screen, because I think that it's as part of your QMS under MDR, it's definitely going to be necessary.
All right. Our next question comes from Catalina, and I think she's asking, when do you know that you have enough clinical data to perform safety and effectiveness of your device?
So in other words, how do we establish the sufficiency of data to, how do we establish that there is data sufficiency to establish the safety and performance of the device as intended? So this is the old data sufficiency question, which is very, it's very up in the air. Sarah, do you have, we don't have the magic bullet for this at all. And I can tell you that with our clients, large and small, this is one of the most common topics of conversation. One of the most common questions we get in these webinars is, what is the magic formula for understanding data sufficiency? I'll let Sarah jump in here in a minute, but I would say that go to the basics. Do you have data that we talked already about? Did you do a good literature search? It is what it is. If you did a very good job on your literature search, your time range, the methodology, all of that, and you came up with 3 articles to help establish the sufficiency of your safety or performance, quote, it is what it is. But if you didn't do that, then the notified bodies begin to wonder, are you leaving rocks unturned? Are you not looking where you're supposed to? But the sufficiency of data, I would say other things. Do you have data points? Do you have data that backs up your indications, your patient population, how your device is used? We talked about this earlier, all of its sizes. If you've got missing pieces there, that you've got plenty of data on the large bore, but you have none on the small bore, then you've got a problem with the small bore. And that might then lead into questions like, should we separate out the small bore and the CER away from the other bores? Or do we need to bring in an equivalent device just to bolster the device data for the small bore? These are all strategic questions that you need to answer up front, and then hope that you have the sufficiency of data to answer the notified body's questions. They're going to be looking at all of the aspects of the device. You know, again, its usage, its patient population, its sizes, its indication for use, all of that. And if you're missing pieces in there, they're going to flag that. Sarah, do you have any further comments on that?
Yes, this kind of plays into one of the questions in the Q&A box as well. Like, if there is a lack of state-of-the-art data, if you did your best, how do you know how far back you need to go? And can you still consider it state-of-the-art if you do have to keep digging? I think the way that I've handled this in the past for clients where there just isn't a whole lot of published clinical data recently is that I remind them that it doesn't have to be state of the art with regards to all other alternatives. You know, if you are doing a test that uses an antigen-based testing and everything else is now PCR-based testing, you know, you've jumped to the next generation of testing, you wouldn't compare yourself to a new generation test. You're comparing yourself to the previous generation. And you have to be state of the art with respect to a particular scenario. So in that case, it will help to go back a little bit to provide that historical perspective and to also show that any clinical guidelines that you've identified are based on that historic data that seems relatively consistent over the past 10, 20 years even. So you may still refer back to older data, but you don't have to be state of the art compared to every other possible treatment option that's out there. You have to be state of the art relative to your closest competitors. And you also want to show how the scenarios by which you can still be considered state of the art. If there's a newer device out there, but maybe it's not commonly used in patients who have certain comorbidities, your device would be still a better option for those patients. So that would be how you would justify that, is that you can state that, you know, our device is still commonly used under these scenarios and in these circumstances. The acceptance criteria, while we didn't identify a lot of data in our current search, if you go back to the previously reported searches, which the guidelines are based off of, they report ranges from this to this as being acceptable. So it's all about telling the story, but also documenting that you did your due diligence, you looked everywhere, your searches were designed properly, it just wasn't there to find. And that's going to be what they're going to be looking for.
Great, thanks, Sarah. You've also helped answer Carrie's question, which I was going to get to next. So now let's get to Dan's question. How do you claim the safety and performance meet the criteria if the only available data set is PMS?
Well, I'd say that's problematic because PMS data is only safety data.
Mm-hmm.
So Sarah, do you have further thoughts on that?
There should be performance data published on competitor devices. It's going to be and surely internally you would have some sort of performance data. I think it comes down to making sure that you've properly identified the correct safety and performance objectives, and that those are in line with your own internal processes and what you're measuring for your own device.
Right. And that's a very important point, is like, look inside first, define identify upfront during device development, if you will, and or now, if you haven't done it before, how are we going to measure safety and performance on our devices? Because we're going to have to do this. So what are the performance objectives? And this doesn't need to be an exhaustive list. Sometimes performance objective is a single objective, and a safety objective are a couple of objectives. This doesn't need to be exhaustive, but you're going to need to have those internal conversations about how do we define to the notified body what is the performance of our device, because we're going to need to go out and look internally to develop the data for that on the subject device, and then go to the competitors to pull acceptance criteria. So sorry, Sarah, but this is a critical.
Yeah.
Do you have anything further to add, Sarah?
No, I think it just comes down to asking the right questions and developing those objectives properly. And, you know, performance can be as simple as, you know, technical success of your device. Did it actually correct the problem and perform as intended? And surely you would have some sort of data with regard to that prior to getting to this step in the writing process.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Sandy, and she wants to know if quantitative SPRs are always needed.
So Sarah, you and I discussed this not too long ago. So you want to, this quantitative versus qualitative, I guess, or open-ended. You want to share with the audience what we talked about?
Yeah, this can sometimes be unique to certain medical fields where the scales that they use to measure success are somewhat subjective. It could be something like if you have a contact lens or something like that, measuring dryness. That's a relatively subjective performance measure. You know, whether or not a patient reported dry eye is up to, you know, my version of dry eye may be different than someone else's. But if you can find a way to you can usually find a way to quantify that. So even if it is a subjective, you can state what % of patients reported that safety objective, even if it isn't necessarily itself quantitative. The % reporting is quantitative.
Right. So the thing about this example, which is great, is that it ties back into your PMCF plan. So one of the things under MDR that I know that you're all grappling with is these proactive post-market clinical follow-up studies. And what is your plan for that? What data are you extracting in the post-market clinical follow-up time frame? And are you putting together like questionnaires? And Sarah's example was great. How do you quantify the patient's perception of dry eye on using a Likert scale from, for example, a 1 to 5 Likert scale with, you know, no symptomology, my eyes feel fine, all the way to they're very, very dry and I have to take my contacts out, something like that. That's quantifying. It's a subjective assertion on the part of the patient. I mean, obviously they can't measure dryness, but they have the subjective feeling of dryness. And that's all that matters, because now you've defined what the safety is, the perception of dryness in the eye, for example. That can be the performance or possibly even a safety goal. And then you define what that is. And then because it's based upon the patient's perception, you define a scale, like a Likert scale, that says from no perception of dryness to it's so bad I have to take the contacts out. And then there's your quantification.
Okay, we have just a few more minutes here, so this may end up being our last question. Here it is. What sort of claims and objectives are acceptable? Is it purely technical claims, or are they supposed to be marketing claims?
Well, Sarah, one thing I would say is I would wonder what sort of claims are acceptable, because a claim by definition is a marketing tool. It's not
Yes.
a technical, it's not a tech there. I'm not aware of what a technical claim is. Other than, are you claiming something in the marketing arena, the post-market arena? Are you making a claim about a technical aspect of your device? Possibly, but it's still a marketing claim. It's not, there's no such thing as far as I know of what a technical claim is. All claims are marketing claims, whether they're about a performance or a safety issue or user issue or aspect of your device. Do you have thoughts on that, Sarah?
Yes, I think in this case, in many cases, the marketing claims are going to be much more broad, whereas the objectives are going to be a little bit more precise and, quite frankly, quantifiable. Something that is more objective, like as the name states, it has to be objective. A marketing claim is more like, this is better, or this is worse, you know, their device is worse, our device is better with this respect. Whereas an objective is defining how you're actually measuring success. So,
right. So this
yeah,
question sort of mixes two worlds, I think. By using the word objectives, we're talking about safety and performance objectives and acceptance criteria of actual data that must be quantitative, quantifiable. And so those are the objectives, safety and performance objectives. But when we mix in words such as claims and marketing claims, now we're out there in the land of risk and benefit analysis and the establishment of claims with data. Wouldn't you agree, Sarah? It's kind of it's two separate processes within a clinical evaluation.
right, exactly. It's not to be, you wouldn't want to confuse a marketing claim with a safety and performance objective.
Correct. Very good. Great. Any more questions, or is our time up?
Yeah, I think our time is up, but I think that's a good place to end on. I hope we were able to answer most of your questions. I know there was a lot of you here, so if we didn't get to yours, we'll reach out to you by email later today. You're also welcome to send us any other questions you have to consult@criterionedge.com. For more questions on the content we discussed today, or if you would like to learn about our services, you can schedule a free scoping of your CER. Our contact information again is here on the screen, consult@criterionedge.com. Thank you again, Sarah, and thank you, Laurie, and everyone for joining us and for your wonderful questions. Take care, and I hope to see you at our next webinar.